Hi, I'm Leslie Maddox, and today I'm sharing with you a review of first language lessons for the well-trained mind, and I'll be giving you my recommendations and best tips for using this book. I have used this for both of my older two boys for their first grade year. So this past year, I used it at the beginning of the year with my middle son. But I did end up abandoning this book before the school year is out for both of them. So what I'm going to share with you is kind of a general overview and my thoughts about it, why we abandoned it, and kind of my best tips for using it. Like if I were going to try to use this again with my youngest, what I would do. All right, so First Language Lessons is a parent-led scripted language arts curriculum. On the back of the book it says that it's about grammar, but I feel like it does focus a lot on grammar, but I feel like it's a little more general language arts. It has 100 lessons in it. So you can see in the table of contents, 100 lessons, and then there's a final grammar review. Each lesson, I'll turn to lesson 1, has a back and forth conversation between the parent and child, or the instructor and student, as it says here. This one's a very short lesson. They do get longer. For example, here, lesson 48, and we never even got to lesson 48, but lesson 48, you see here that it goes this page and then on to the next. So depending on what's being covered in that lesson, it's shorter or longer. Some of the lessons have something like a picture study in them, and there's this back and forth conversation. Some you read a little story. See if I can find one of those. Like here you have the little girl who wanted to be dirty. So you read this little story and then have this back and forth conversation with the student. As you can see from the table of contents, the grammar topics you'll discuss with your student are common nouns, proper nouns. Moving on, you go to pronouns, I believe, are here somewhere, and then verbs. So over the course of the year, those are the general grammar topics you'll be talking about. There's also a lot of poem memorization, so they'll introduce poems and then having different lessons reviewing those poems. The poems, for the most part, I like. And even though we did end up abandoning this curriculum, I have continued to use the poems with my students, and so like all my kids have memorized all of them from level 1 and level 2 as well, I think. As written, I found it to be kind of awkward and clunky for a couple of reasons. One of them is that students are expected to answer questions in complete sentences. And while I agree that is a good discipline to instill in your students at some point, I don't know about you, but with my first grader, we don't speak like that. That's not how we converse. And so that is a new thing to teach them. I felt like it was an unnecessary complication to have with my little kids. This is supposed to be fun and gentle and short and sweet, but my kids were very frustrated by that aspect of it. So I quickly abandoned the whole responding in a complete sentence. I feel like that's something that when my kids are like 5th and 6th grade, if I decide to do something like this, I feel like that's something that I can instruct them to do. It's like, let's answer in complete sentences, and that they'll do it. But at this level for us, for my family, that was just an unnecessary complication. Another awkward aspect of this book for us was that the examples used to describe the parts of speech I felt were unnecessarily complicated and sometimes required some pre-reading from me as the parent. So, for example, in this situation, kids are supposed to be learning about proper nouns and the names of people, but then added to this was this lesson on family relationships, and that's like throughout this whole part of the book. They talk about family relationships. So For example, it says here the words aunt and uncle name kinds of persons. What are aunts? And my aunt's my mother's or father's sister. And the lessons get even more complicated than this. Now here is where this became a problem for my family, is that we don't often use words like that. We do call some people aunt and uncle, but for like my family, they use the Spanish words. So aunt is tia or titi. Uncle is tío. So then when we were covering this, I felt like I had to then explain all of that to my kids. That, well, we call this person this, we call this person that, but they're the same thing. And really all I just want to talk about are proper nouns, about the names of people. And it gets into this, it goes into cousins, and the kids are expected to tell you in full sentences to describe these family relationships. Uncles are brothers of my father, of my mother or father. And then in the next lesson, talking about cousins are children of my aunts and uncles. And, you know, at this point, it was really frustrating for my kids. And I felt like they weren't learning what they were supposed to be learning, which is proper nouns, because it talks about aunts and uncles and then it goes into their names. Well, can we just talk about the names of people, like people right there in the immediate family, and say, you know, that is their particular name for that person, so that's a proper noun. You know, I felt like that was already challenging enough for my student to understand, since they were still just learning how to read and write and spell, like just beginning spelling, to then introduce things like concepts like a proper noun, a part of speech, and using it, teaching that in this complicated way. It was very awkward and frustrating for my family. I felt it got in the way of the point of the actual lesson. And I tried to simplify it as much as I could, but it got to be work for me to simplify it, where I just wanted to leave it and say, okay, we're supposed to be learning about proper nouns, so let me just do it this other way. And then at that point, it's like, well, why am I using this? Another reason I thought this was awkward, and this lesson's a good example of that, is I don't feel that students are taught one thing at a time, and I think that's really important. That, you know, like even as an adult, I want to learn kind of one thing at a time, and then as I'm more familiar with one topic, then I can add it on to another new topic. But I felt like kids are in this book expected to learn like many new things in one lesson. So don't be misled by the shortness of this lesson. This short lesson right here caused like drama in my homeschool and took longer and was like just a mess to deal with. Very frustrating. Another awkward aspect of it was the poems. You're told when to review poems and when to learn new poems. I felt that poetry memorization was somewhat rushed, especially with my oldest. Spoken word is his weakest learning style, his weakest learning method. And the pace that they have you memorizing poems at that time was not good for him. You know, since we've worked on poetry memorization for the last 4 years, he's really strengthened that and can memorize poems much easier. But at that time, when it was a new thing for us, and since that was such a weak learning method for him, we needed more time with each poem. And since it was my first year of homeschooling, I'm like, well, this is taking so long. Why is it taking so long? And you know, that caused me to lack confidence in my teaching. As far as recommendations go, I would recommend first language lessons to students that prefer the spoken word as a learning method, since that is the primary, you know, almost only learning method that's used in this book. I would also recommend it for students that do well with receiving instruction one-on-one, because this is a scripted conversation between parent and child, and that was the issue I ran into with my middle son, that even though the spoken word is one of his primary learning methods and one of his strongest learning methods, he does not like one-on-one work. He does not like this back and forth conversation to learn something. He wants to learn independently, and this is not set up for that at all. But if you do have a student who loves that sitting with you and learning things, and then this will be a good fit for them. So who would I not recommend this to? I would not recommend this to any student that that strongly prefers any learning method other than spoken word, if you're going to use this as written. So I'll talk about in my best tips how you might change that. I would not recommend this to students that have a strong dislike for one-on-one learning, since this is a back and forth scripted conversation. I would not recommend this to students that are not yet comfortable with abstract concepts. I also would not recommend this to students that are not yet reading. So if your student is just not even reading yet, like you're just sounding things out, you may want to focus on some basic language art skills first, like writing sentences and capitalizing the first word in the sentence and putting punctuation at the end, that kind of thing. So I wouldn't recommend this to a student that that isn't reading yet, because they're not going to understand the importance of a noun in a sentence if they can't even read a sentence, if you follow me. All right, so what are my best tips for using first language lessons? As written, I feel like first language lessons is only appropriate for a specific type of student, a student that strongly prefers the spoken word. So I would recommend using it only as a spine if you have a different type of student. That's my tip for you. Use it as a spine, meaning you go and look at the table of contents, see the progression through the parts of speech, use that as a guide for you, and then supplement with worksheets and activities, maybe from Teachers Pay Teachers or looking on Pinterest to solidify the concepts taught in here. Let's say read to lesson 3, common nouns, and read through that lesson, do that lesson with them, and then the next time you cover language arts, cover the topic of common nouns via a worksheet or a hands-on activity, or whatever learning method best suits your student. Or you could do it the other way around, introduce the concept. You see that you're going to be talking about common nouns or proper nouns, so before you get to that, have a lesson where you're not working in this book. Instead, you're doing some other activity to introduce that concept, and then go and read through this. My other tip is to get the poems. Like here's one of the poems, The Caterpillar, and they have it here in the book. But to have some other way to read this poem, I downloaded some printables of the poems and I laminated them. And that's what I've been using for memorizing, and we just do it at our pace. I don't follow the recommendation. I followed, like for this first book, I followed the order that they introduced the poems in here. So we learned the one poem, and then the next, and then the next. Learn it at our own pace. We might spend a few days just learning the first and second line, maybe a week. And then we introduce the next line, That's how we've been learning our poems. And it really helps it to have it in some other form other than just from having to turn back to the book to do it, even if you just type it up yourself. And laminating was important because they got so much use. I think it tells you here to read the poem to a student and discuss it, and then kind of saying it 3 times. That's just not going to work for everybody. If you're interested in more videos like this one, where I give you my tips and recommendations for how to incorporate a book or curriculum into your homeschool, please refer to the playlist at the side. Tap on that. That's where I'm going to store all of these types of videos. And I will talk to you in the next video. Bye-bye.